This is the long version of ANZAC-Day, so this will be number 11, I guess, in the Warbles in the Wilderness series. This is in the book Bush Poems. From October 1980 until January 1984, I was a student nurse at a repatriation hospital, Concord Repat General Hospital, Sydney, New South Wales. While I was there, I nursed 2,000 combat veterans, war veterans, of Australia's military adventures from 1914 to 1984. I nursed people who'd been in just about every theatre of the war imaginable, from people who flew on airships doing anti-submarine patrols in the North Sea in the First World War, Gallipoli veterans. One bloke was actually on the 1914 amphibious expedition to West Papua that the Australian military forces embarked on. I've nursed Spanish Civil War veterans, World War II veterans from every theatre, Korea, Malaya, even American mercenaries with the Australians in Malaya. So I know a bit about war, and what I learned as a nurse picking up the pieces convinced me that what I'd been raised to believe as a child swallowing the ANZAC-Day legend was basically a crock. And so in 1995 I wrote a poem called ANZAC-Day, which I will now perform. ANZAC-Day. The life force creates a human, lets them live and breathe and talk. In terms of design and of construction, it's a masterpiece of work. When a woman births a baby with her muscles hard as steel, screaming in a shower of tears and blood, 'tis not a minor thing, I feel. A child's mind is ever trusting, smiling, learning, growing bold. Should a grown-up tell untruths? How do little children know? Believing all that they are told. And when they're shown of war's great glory, school-child Anzacs marching up the street, they fantasise they too are warrior heroes while they synchronise their feet. So should the flags unfurl and bugles blow, if the season comes again for shooting humans dead, won't they up and off and go, because some politician said? And when the ones who live come home back here, screaming, shit-scared in their sleep, I wonder if they too will stand in glory for the school kids in those marches in the street. Australia-New Zealand Army Corps Day. That's how it's passed along. It's like a mental cultural virus, what the evolutionary biologists would call a meme. And I find it objectionable. When the little children see ordinary people, normal people from around the town, janitors, taxi drivers, odd job men, shop assistants, standing in neat straight rows, wearing shiny little medallions and trinkets to prove how brave they are, and the whole town claps and cheers, and the little children just want to grow up so they too can be a war hero, and they believe all of it. I was busking at a Kentucky Fried Chicken place once, and a Bosnian refugee threw $10 in the hat when he heard the poem ANZAC-Day, and after he heard it, he burst into tears, and he said that the way to get peace in the Balkans would be to kill all the grandmothers, because that way there'd be nobody to bounce the 3-year-olds on their knees and tell them they had to eat all of their greens and bread crusts to grow up big and strong to be able to handle a gun, so that they could go over the hill and into the valley on the other side and kill all the people there, because 600 years ago somebody from that valley came and stole our Humpty-Hump great-grandfather's pig. And he said, if you just go and kill all the grandmothers, then there won't be anybody to teach the children that they want to play war games when they grow up. And so on ANZAC Day in 1995 I wrote the poem, sitting up here in my little hut listening to the ANZAC Day rave on the ABC radio. And in December 1996 I published it in a book of poetry, which is in the Australian National Library, ISBN number 0646 306 74X. Contact them and they'll download it for you. It's on page 31 of the book, as I'm not actually uploading these in the sequence they appear on the index. And here's what the front cover looks like. It's actually a 1985 drawing. I did as a self-portrait. But the thing is, I used to be one of those little kids who dreamed of growing up to be a war hero. And although I grew up learning to read on the history of the Australian Army in the Second World War, because the old man's holiday house at the coast had belonged to a war veteran who left his books there, and I grew up reading them when I was a young hunting, shooting, fishing meat eater. Being the style of kid who took a semi-automatic rifle to school 4 times a year, because I was captain of the school rifle team. And that there is my grandfather's semi-automatic target rifle, which I surrendered the action of to the New South Wales Police when they were declared illegal in Australia, and I've converted it to a camera mount. But because my mother's father had been a pilot in the First World War, I'm afraid I was a gone duck as far as Biggle stories were concerned. I just wanted to be a fighter pilot. Saved up and bought history books. When I was 13, so I've always been aware that the Australian Flying Corps sent 2 aeroplanes in crates to West Papua with the hope of bombing and strafing the Lutheran missionaries in 1914 because they were so obviously German. But what did something like that matter when we're looking at a glorious honourable tradition with heroes in the family tree? And I had not one pterodactyl in the family tree, my mother's father. There was also Dad's uncle, pterodactyl and an Archaeopteryx. And because I was so terribly convinced that my grandfather had flown a Sopwith-Camel, it came as quite a shock to me, wallowing in historical Australian Biggle stories. I couldn't find my grandfather anywhere. But I did discover that Lieutenant L. Wharton found himself separated from his companions on the 11th, but undaunted took on 2 LVG 2-seaters. After sending one down, the Australian must have received the impression that the whole German air service was at his heels, when half a dozen fighters shrieked down seeking revenge. With his camel badly damaged and petrol pouring from holes in the tank behind his seat, Wharton sought safety in the clouds below. Unfortunately, after emerging from their shelter, he was wounded by anti-aircraft fire and crashed on the British side of the lines, later being invalided back to England. A few days later, Lieutenant S. Howard, who had joined the squadron with Wharton, was wounded during an attack on ground positions, along with Lieutenant R.G. Smallwood, and they went to hospital. Lieutenant Eddles followed them after being hit on the 25th, but he was more fortunate than Wharton's replacement, who was killed on the 22nd. So, it was Dad's uncle who flew the Sopwith-Camels and shot down the Germans, and was Biggles, not me mother's father, who learnt to fly as a civilian in Sydney in 1917, and because he didn't finish high school, they wouldn't let him try again to learn to fly until late 1918. So Grandpa the Archaeopteryx studied at the No. 2 School of Military Aeronautics, billeted at Oxford University, didn't get his wings till 1919 in March. Les Wharton had won himself a military medal in Poitiers for capturing 500 yards of trench line, got shot in the shoulder. This photo of him here is after he was evacuated from Gallipoli. And apparently there were a lot of broken ankles at Gallipoli, and some of them were fairly deliberate. But in his medical records it states clearly that it was an accidental break and he didn't do it deliberately. But he's got a pretty lovely case of what they call the 1,000-yard stare. It could be because at 11 o'clock on the morning, I think it was 17 minutes past 11 on the morning of the 25th, his little brother, Harry Hopton Wharton, known to everybody as Hope, was shot, and Les here had to carry his little brother down to the beach and put him on a rowboat to go out to the hospital ship, where it took him 3 days to die from peritonitis and septicemia. So he went back home, and then he went to England and to France and got a medal and got a promotion. And then Les learned to fly on Avro 504 Ks before going on to Sopwith Pups. And then he went to 4 Squadron AFC flying camels, and I don't know why he sent this particular picture to his parents, because it's not an Australian Flying Corps camel. On the original you can see it's got a Lewis gun on its top wing, which means it's a British Royal Navy Sopwith-Camel, but it is a photograph of a camel, and that's what he flew. So here's the bit that gets me. 2 of my grandfather's brothers had the sort of mind that can accept the proposition that a Serbo-Croatian shot an Austro-Hungarian in a town called Sarajevo, therefore, thus and because, they joined the Australian Imperial Forces to go and invade Turkey because West Papua surrendered so easily. Yeah? Now, 59,300 Australians volunteered to be shot and killed in the First World War, and they were. And Australia was the only country that fielded an all-volunteer force. About 125,000 were wounded, and another 180 to 220,000 joined up and came home without anything but emotional trauma. That was in the First World War. We only had 4 million people in the country. 67,500 volunteered to be shot and killed. One of my grandfather's brothers was one of them. Another one of my grandfather's brothers, he volunteered to be shot and wounded. Twice, in fact. 3 times if you count his broken foot. My grandfather on the other side of the family, he volunteered to go and have a go, but he didn't make it in time. Now, there's a lot of people who get sold a military career on the idea that it's good for your family, it protects your culture and your way of life. But here's a funny thing. If you look at the history book, you'll find that in the First World War, Australia had 59,330 killed, and in the Second World War, when we had 6 or 7 million people, we only had 27,000 killed. So we had more people. Once again, we had an all-volunteer force serving overseas, but we had less people killed, because less people had the kind of mind that'll volunteer to go and fight and shoot at a stranger because a politician you wouldn't vote for tells you to shoot at somebody for wearing a different uniform. In Korea, 13,500 Australians volunteered and 360 were killed in 3 years. Australia's involvement in Malaya in the 50s was such a pathetic one that they don't even mention casualties, appearing nowhere in the textbook. Then we have Vietnam. 500 casualties, 50,000 went, and we had to conscript half of them because we no longer had the volunteers. We'd got rid of the DNA to make that sort of a brain. There's just not enough of it. It's not completely eradicated from the gene pool. We can still come up with these people to go and play hopscotch in the minefields in Absurdistan. We've just had another 3 shot by their Afghan comrades. But on the whole, less than 4% of Australia's high school children say they would consider a career in the military. The word is starting to get out that combat veterans have 8 times the rate of being homeless, 2 times the rate of being psychotic, 2 times the suicide rate, by death by suicide rate, and their children have 3 times the death by suicide rate, 1.8 times the death by accident rate, 1.2 times the death by illness rate. So joining any military farce is a Darwin Award upon enlistment. You are breeding yourself out of existence, and you collect your Darwin Award when you get buried or when you bury your offspring. 5% of humans have 2 genes for killing other humans. 10% have 1 gene for killing other humans. US Marine Corps infantrymen in the Second World War, 13% of them fired their weapon first time in combat. Professor-David-Grosseman, 2-tour Vietnam Green Beret veteran, found that 98% of people are psychiatric casualties after 60 days continuous combat. The other 2% are sociopaths before they go into combat, and they thrive in an environment where they are permitted to kill other humans. Thou shalt not kill.